reason to uh,
Sorry.
okay, which I thought was a good reason to, pull back and tell the story again. But the other common link between many of these serial killers of this period is, well, A, they're white, and B, they presented themselves as, very functional people in society. Richard Cottingham, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted
Mhm.
Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. You would never guess they were serial killers if you knew them during that period, and I find that horrifyingly fascinating, and much more consistent with the reality of crime than our perception of it. We like to think that serial killers are evil 24/7, that they emerge from the shadows with, dripping with blood and, looking creepy. And that gives us a false sense of comfort, that because that's how they're portrayed in movies, like
Mhm.
Buffalo Bill and in Silence of the Lambs, or, you know, this idea that serial killers are evil 24/7, gives us this false sense of comfort that, well, we can avoid being a victim because we can easily recognize them, prior to becoming a victim. But the truth is, in my experience in covering crime in the past 30 years, is that the people you least expect and most often trust are usually the ones who do evil. Whether it's a priest who commits pedophilia, or Bernie Madoff, who, used his Jewish identity to bilk and to gain the trust of other wealthy Jewish people, and not so wealthy in some cases, to, you know, destroy the lives of many people with a trusting avuncular smile. That's what I find so fascinating about Gacy in particular. I mean, he was, you know, a clown, a Democratic precinct captain, everyone, the envy of the neighborhood through these lavish parties, busy local contractor, active in Democratic politics. Was a Democratic precinct captain. The fact that people vouched for him when he was first arrested, it just I find utterly fascinating, because that's how evil in the world actually operates. And so, to me, reminding a younger generation that's not familiar with these stories, I think is it's a lesson I want my daughters to have. That just because somebody acts a certain way, it doesn't mean you should trust them. So that lesson, I think, can't be overstated enough. And since this is a story that's been told before, why tell it now? Well, I think it's important to pull back and look at it through a social justice lens, and to see how the attitudes of the day allowed Gacy to flourish. In particular, the attitude towards the gay community. If you were a victim of an assault, you were afraid to come forward, because in some places it was still illegal to engage in homosexual activities. The police generally had a bad attitude towards people who came in with those kinds of complaints. And when you look at the history of his crime, the fact that police didn't put two and two together way earlier is just, utterly shocking.
It is definitely. And there are so many alarming elements in each episode. Also, like you said, horrifyingly intriguing and interesting. So, describe the making of process. How did you approach this story as opposed to any of the other investigative crime series that you've made?
Well, when you have a serial killer story in particular, you have to always be very sensitive to the balance of victim portrayal to serial killer portrayal. So that was always forefront in my mind. And I'm happy to say that we have several people participating in the show that had never participated before. In particular, the victim Steve Nemmers, who, you know luckily survived, but has a harrowing tale to tell. Um, so that was one aspect, is, the balance between victim portrayal and deep dive into Gacy. So that's always on our minds. And then the other thing that's on my mind is how to best utilize the audio tapes, because Gacy is an unreliable narrator. which means he lies a lot, and you certainly don't, which means you certainly don't want to give oxygen to his falsehoods. But to me, the inclusion of those falsehoods, it's not it's the literal facts of what he's talking about in some instances is not interesting to me. It's a portrait of a sociopath, and so you see him blaming others, even blaming others for, you know, he with one victim had already put the knot around his neck and then went to go answer the phone, and when he came back, the victim was dead, almost as if he's saying the victim killed himself. And so it's important to understand the psychology of these kinds of killers because they truly have no remorse, no empathy, and they frequently shift the blame to others. And so, how to utilize the tapes was, a forefront in my mind. And then the third, I think, third element of what do you keep in mind when you're making this kind of a show, which I think is what your question was versus other shows, is that this show, because I know how well the Bundy, the first season was Ted Bundy, and to my surprise, it did extraordinarily well. It was very popular. It was the number one unscripted show or documentary, unscripted, whatever you want to call it. It was the number one unscripted show on Netflix in 2019, and a significant number of that audience came from outside of the United States. So that told me and informed me while I was making this one that I'm actually serving two very different audiences. The first audience is the US based true crime aficionados who know every detail of the Bundy story. And the second very large group of people, as it turned out from the Bundy experience, is that there are a lot of people coming to Netflix for this type of programming who don't know the Bundy or the Gacy story, and they're coming at it needing to hear the full 360 story for the first time. So how do you serve an audience that doesn't know the story and while simultaneously serving an audience that knows every detail about it? And so for me, that's about leaning into what's new and what hasn't been told before. And so we have a number of people who have not participated in previous Bundy shows, like the aforementioned victim Steve Nemmers, another technician, a guy named Dan Genty, who heroically, led the excavation of that site. By the way, when I talk about police ineptitude, it's not about the people in the show itself. It's about all the missing clues and effort prior to him being arrested. But I give all the cops that were in the show and investigators, from the moment they suspected him through the excavation of the home, they all just did a heroic job. So I just want to be clear when I'm talking about police ineptitude, I'm not talking about the cops in the show. But I forgot my point was, sorry,
That's
my
okay.
point was that, in serving both audiences, I wanted to make sure that we have a, very complete storytelling, but using new elements that haven't been heard or seen before. So that excavation footage hadn't been seen before. There's quite a few people in the show that haven't participated before. Even exploiting the angle of the fact that they're doing new victim identification. So you want to give the casual viewer who knows nothing, a complete experience, but the people who know and have seen every other Gacy show, you want to make sure you're offering them new information and a new perspective.
I understand that. When you're making a film, it always comes down to the script. You hear that all the time from everybody. When you're making these non-scripted series, um, what is your writing process, or how do you take your elements? Just like you said, you have thousands of elements. What makes it to the to the episode, and what doesn't? How do you separate it?
Yeah, well, I had a great team of people, and the showrunner was a woman named Catherine Park. The co-executive producer was a guy named Ted Schillinger. Um, and together we have lots of creative conversations. And the editing process for us is like the script writing process, lots of trial and error and trying to figure out what's important. You go into the shoot with an open mind. Of course, we talk about all the story elements and what we need to get from each interview, but you also want to allow the interview to be an organic process of discovery of things you can't predict in advance, and then you just haul all that material in the edit room, and you know, um, it's hard to explain, but things start to develop a rhythm and take on a life of its own, and that tells you which story points to drop. And it's a little hard to explain other than to say the editing process is like the screenwriting process. And you're right, it's all in the script. In this case, the script is the final show, so either it works or it doesn't work. But it's the editing process is challenging, but it's my favorite part of the process for that reason, because you're actually then really crafting the material.
Okay, thank you. So what surprised you most about making this project?
Um, you hear 33 bodies under a floorboard or whatever, but in the crawl space, and that's been the lore of the case. But when you really spend time thinking about it, telling that story, it's just the degree to which it sickened me, and the degree to which it could have been avoided. Really, I was surprised at how much anger bubbled up in me as I was telling the story, because I've done many terrible crime stories, but this one really got to me because I feel like it could have been easily avoided. There were so many clues along the way and so many opportunities to bring Gacy to justice far earlier that,
Mhm.
because people had a bad attitude towards homosexuality, really is the reason so many of these young men lost their lives. It just, you know, it surprised me how emotionally upsetting it made me, because I've tried to separate the making of my films with my just kind of personal headspace, and this one invaded my personal headspace to a much larger degree than I would have liked, because it's a very disturbing story.
Yes, it is. And there are obviously sensitive issues in all of the stories that all of these types of true crime stories. In this case, the lifestyle choices of the victims may not have been known for some of the families. And, how did you go about approaching that? Did you speak to the families, or what was your process for that? It's very sensitive.
Yeah, well, if this was a newer story, I think there would be greater sensitivities about revealing information that they might not have known or something like that, if that's what you mean. I mean, I think story is enough in the past that that was not an issue per se. But of course, you still need to be and want to be extremely sensitive with the victims' families. Of course, we reached out to all of them for which we had information on, and a lot of the family members, didn't tell us not to do the show, but they also did not want to participate, which I understand. They feel like they've talked about this story enough. So we did not get a lot of the families cooperating, but I feel like we had enough critical mass of people that the victims are nicely represented in the show.
Sure. After thousands of hours of tape, did you come to any conclusion how some of his victims were able to get away and others not, and the majority not? Or are there more victims out there, do you think?
I think there probably are more victims, just based on a lot of factors that would be too complicated you know, to say in this format. We'd have to talk for like an hour. Um, uh, Sorry, and what was the first part of your question? I apologize.
How some of the victims were able to there were a couple that were featured that got away.
Yeah, I think it was just it was it was random how he felt, whether or not he felt like they were going to um, be a threat to him or not. It was there is not a rhyme or reason to it, which is part of the mystery and part of the horror of it all. Like some people were able to escape and some weren't.
Sure.
But I don't think there's an organizing principle other than those he felt would reveal, you know, would get him into trouble. He had to terminate, and those that he felt he could get it was better to let the person go. He'd let them go.
I see. So I'm being told to wrap it up. So what was your most memorable moment of this entire process?
Um, I think the most memorable moment was uh, getting an email with the information that these tapes existed shortly on the heels of Bundy, because I actually was expecting Bundy to just be a one-off. I didn't think this would be turning into an ongoing franchise, and so I was surprised. Oh my God, there's more tapes, and in fact, there will probably be another installment of this because we also received tapes from another source. So it just surprises me that there's so much tape that hasn't been heard before for a multitude of these serial killers. I think that was the most surprising, or memorable. Was like, oh, like I thought this was a one-off. Maybe I'll do a second season. So,
Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time. I certainly appreciate it. And I appreciate the insight, the investigative reporting on the series, and just all of the information. Thank you again so much.
thank you so much. I appreciate all your intelligent questions.
Oh, thank you. Have a nice evening or
Thank
day.
you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Hey, Joe. So Stephanie from Fox is up on deck next. We're still working